Mr. Chairman, I want to just thank you and Senator Graham and the ranking members of this committee for your leadership and your long hours of work to lead this committee, I think, in a proper and helpful direction to better understand not only what happened on September 11th, the horror of that event, but also to try to better understand back through the previous 7 or 8 or 9 years, starting with the bombing in 1993 of the World Trade Center, what kind of enemy we're up against, what kind of successes we've had, and certainly the people at this table have had considerable successes, but also I think what kind of mistakes or failures or disconnects or gaps are in the system and still existing in the system so that we can go forward and fix the problems. I'm hopeful that these hearings are not about finger pointing and blame games and seeking to pin the tail on somebody, or even, as Judge Freeh talked about, a smoking gun. I think we're talking more about what kinds of mistakes and gaps and cracks are in the system that allowed these snakes to crawl through and terrorize our people, inflict incredible damage, and kill over 3,000 people. Ms. White, I'd like to start with you because of some of the things I've read about your successes. You dusted off about a 140-year-old law that hadn't been used since the Civil War to go after terrorists. You took a very creative approach. You called it, or it was called, the law of seditious conspiracy to go after enemies of the United States and to increase penalties from 5 to 20 and 30 years if you could successfully prosecute them. You also said in your testimony that you realized in 1993 you were up against, and I'll quote, a long-term, highly dangerous enemy. It wasn't something that was a freak accident in 1993. You then sought to share with other federal law enforcement agencies and an intelligence community information. But beyond sharing, I think we're talking about true collaboration and implementation. I'm tired of hearing the word sharing. Sharing too oftentimes around here means you bucked it over to somebody else and nothing was done with it. So I'd like to know, fairly succinctly, if you can, to get the conversation started, what kinds of formal mechanisms and informal mechanisms did you put in place to get this cooperation to work successfully on these series of cases through the 90s, to prosecute, but also to look back, to compile this information on Al-Qaeda, and to start to put together the pieces that we knew we were in for a long fight, and to try to help make us preventive rather than reactive?
Well, to some extent, it happened initially by happenstance. The Trade Center, was bombed in 1993 in, our district. And as I think I said in my testimony, it's in my written statement, because of the Day of Terror plot, which really was at the same time, but I call it the follow-on plot, and what we learned through that, that's what convinced me and others in my office working on these matters, and the FBI working with us, obviously, just, it's long-term, it's a dangerous risk. And, and from there, we did make the decision that we didn't want to lose that information. We knew what we didn't know, too. We didn't know, nearly as much as there was to know. We knew the risk was there. We knew the danger was high. And then we proceeded in a terrific working relationship with the FBI and the CIA, throughout the years, eventually culminating in the joint efforts of the Bureau and the CIA on bin Laden and Al-Qaeda that we've all talked about, culminating in his indictment by our office before he'd attacked anyone, really, in June of 1998. But it's a long-term process. You learn more every day. And to me, the key is getting the information in one spot where it's not one spot, but in an integrated place, at least, where it's understood and can be acted upon. I mean, one barrier that I didn't mention that I'd like to, and then I'll be quiet here, is the difficulty of language in dealing with terrorism. I mean, I know you've heard a lot about that, and there aren't enough interpreters. Well, that is a huge, huge problem. You can have every FISA application in the world approved, but if you don't know what your reel of tape says, and we ran into that.
Or translating the evidence.
Well, and it's not just Arabic, but it's an obscure dialect of Urdu or Arabic, and there aren't many people in the world, certainly with a security clearance, that can understand accurately what you have. So to me, going forward, the more we can do to understand what we have, real time, and then share it real time. But we're a long way from that.
I appreciate your comments about language. We're trying to work on that very area in our intelligence authorization bill. Now, Ms. White, you must have at times, as the Blind Sheikh case and the Manila plot and the bombings of the embassy, as all these things are coming down on you, did you ever say you're overwhelmed, even though you thought you had pretty good communication set up with other agencies? Did you ever say, we're not going to get it done this way? We need more cooperation with the intelligence. We need military help to go after the sanctuaries. This is not going to do the trick. We got to take this higher.
The cases we got extraordinary cooperation on, they were exceedingly difficult. I mean, I think the success rate masks how difficult they were, but the cooperation we got from the Bureau and the intelligence community was extraordinary. But again, as you've heard us say this morning, and certainly it was my view, that we were just, when we could act to neutralize, we did through criminal prosecutions and investigations. But this was a much bigger problem. This, in my mind, very early on, was a problem for the military. I mean, we're talking about a worldwide...
Did you ever bring that up? Did you ever go to anybody and say, I'm overwhelmed, we're not going to get this done through prosecuting cases, we're not going to even get this done through good collaboration? This is a lot bigger for this district and for the country than this.
Well, again, overwhelmed, not overwhelmed in the cases, as difficult as they were, but I certainly expressed the view. I certainly expressed the view to the officials in the Justice Department. Director Freeh and I discussed it. I mean, this was, it was quite clear. But again, I go back to what I said this morning. I was not under the impression that prosecutions were our counterterrorism strategy. I still am not. I mean, there was, even from my vantage point, a lot of other things going on. Not the military effort, obviously, we had after September 11th, which I would have liked to have seen as a personal matter after the East Africa embassy bombings. But in fairness...
When you, Ms. White, would press this and be concerned to other people, whether it was Director Freeh at the time or whether it was somebody in Justice, did they ever get back to you and say, we brought it up with such and such and we received a good response or a poor response on that?
Again, I think the response was, everything's under discussion. And I did think our government, again, I know what...
Including military.
Under discussion, but again, I know what I know and I don't know what I don't know. I didn't interface with the Department of Defense or the White House or the NSA. I mean, that was not, I interfaced with the Attorney General, Director Freeh. That's as high, and Director Tenet from time to time. That's as high as my pay grade went, in a sense. But even from that vantage point, it was definitely my impression that our government as a whole was taking this threat very seriously and thinking comprehensively about what to do about it, other than by way of prosecutions. But I was not in that direct loop.
And isn't there a sense of frustration and irony that with all this work, with one of the most effective collaborative efforts we have in the Southern District, that they come back to New York and successfully strike again?
Well, I mean, I think coming back to New York, as horrible as that was and would have ever been, was not something that we didn't expect to happen. I mean, I think, the Trade Center was obviously, was a symbol of our economy, our capitalist economy. Al-Qaeda in particular is into symbolic targets of our system. New York and Washington obviously are, right up on that list and always have been. So it, as tragic and horrific as it was, and it is, it did not come as a surprise that they came back to New York. I think all of us thought it was a matter, whether it be New York or somewhere else, but certainly including New York, there was going to be another attack.
You were not surprised that it came back? No. Judge Freeh, let me read, I think, some testimony from you from a House subcommittee in 1995. Everybody talks about when George Tenet declared war on al-Qaeda in 1998. You said this is back as far back as 1995. Quote, "I'm greatly concerned about terrorist attacks here on American soil. The effort, as in Oklahoma City, will be to murder as many as possible through a single blow," unquote. Is that accurate? Is that your quote?
Yes. I mean,
so back in 1995, 6 years before they successfully come after the World Trade Center for the second time, you're predicting that they do this. Now, after the 1998 Africa embassy bombings, there are some 200 FBI counterterrorism cases that are opened after that bombing. Can you quickly tell me, how do you communicate with and follow up on these kinds of domestic cases to try to, not overseas, we know you did your best on the COBAR and you followed through on some of these things. What are you thinking, and what are you trying to pursue domestically then at that case in this particular specific area?
no, I'm pleased to answer the question on two levels. One, the 1995 statement speaking for itself, but of course that's, as you've heard here several times repeated today, that's a description of the 1993 World Trade Tower bombing, where the plan was to, as mentioned by my colleague here, destroy 2 towers. In fact, Yosef told us after the event that they also wanted to lace the fertilizer bomb with chemical agents so they could kill thousands but didn't have enough money to complete the plan. But that brings me back to my earlier point. We were intensely focused on the domestic threat here in the United States, and the notion that we were fighting terrorism overseas and consumed overseas is absolutely inconsistent with our experience and that reality. Now, the 200 cases are opened upon leads, credible information, whether they come from informants or electronic surveillance. If you notice, hundreds and hundreds of cases are being opened in the United States on the basis of information and leads which have been exploited in Afghanistan, a very important source of leads with respect to potential terrorists inside the United States. So that's where those cases generated from. How are they monitored? They're monitored like any other case that we're responsible for, which is of significance. Cases come in different forms. In July of 2000, we indicted a group of people in Charlotte, North Carolina. You may not have noticed the press release because they would be in charge with cigarette smuggling. But they were radical Islamic fundamentalists who we believe were terrorists. And we couldn't make a terrorist case on them, but we could make a cigarette smuggling case on them. So the cases are worked like any other case, but you need leads to generate them. You need credible information, even uncorroborated, to start that process. And the explosion of cases that you see now, many of them are because FBI agents in Pakistan and Afghanistan, working with their colleagues, are finding hard drives and images which are leading to identification of terrorists within the United States.
Judge, as hardworking as you are, as prescient as you were, saying this is going to happen back as far as 1995, and as honest as you are, I admire you personally and professionally. But don't you feel at some point with all this going on in the world and your frustration in communicating, you've just talked about how frustrating your technology was with 56 field offices. How do you follow up with that kind of 20 or 30-year-old technology and communication systems with 200 counterterrorism cases that are open in the field? I mean, this has to be extremely frustrating for you at the top of this pyramid.
Yeah, extremely frustrating. As I said in my opening statement, you know, we're on the way to fix that, and it's not rocket science. It's desktops, it's servers, it's networks, it's things that, for the most part, you can buy off the shelf and then maybe modify for security reasons. We didn't have that technology. We tried to get it. As I said before, I take responsibility for not getting it all when we needed it most. But it's not like,
is it getting there now?
well, Trilogy now has been funded for Part 2. And since September 11th, the Congress has given several hundreds of millions of dollars for this technology. So we're well on our way to doing that. Could we have used it before? Absolutely. Could we better work the 200 cases? No question about it. I mean, we've worked cases for the last 94 years. When I was an agent, I used to keep my data on an index card. We can still work the cases, but you can't deal with a global organization that uses the internet and Hawala finance transactions, and has, as I mentioned before, not an organization, but a pan-national collaborative membership with index cards.
But if your field agents are working off index cards and not collaborating and sharing information through a database about information collected in Phoenix or Oklahoma City or Minneapolis with respect to people from the Middle East training in schools for pilots, I mean, you cannot run a modern system with that kind of antiquated communications, right?
No, cannot be done.
So how could we have done this? How could we have coordinated these counterterrorism cases at this point with this kind of old system and index cards and legal files sitting in a file case back in the office in Phoenix?
Well, the fact of the matter is we made some extraordinary cases, and as Ms. White mentioned, prevented major acts of terrorism in 1993 when we had maybe not as antiquated a system vis-a-vis 2001, but still a subpar and not state-of-the-art system. So I'm not saying we couldn't make any cases. In answer to your question about the 200 cases, we could do them better, and we could coordinate all these bits and pieces much better than we've done with better technology.
You have said a couple times that you had an excellent relationship with Director Tenet. To what extent, Judge, was your work with an agency such as the NSA to pinpoint sources of communication in the U.S. which were directed at known radicals abroad? Did you have a good relationship with General Minahan and then General Hayden? How often did you meet with them? Did you work with the NSA to go after known radicals?
Yeah, we had, we had personal, excellent relationships. We had agency relationships. They were present in the Counterterrorism Center, not just at the agency, but at the FBI. There was exchanges of information, not the exchanges of officers to the extent that there was with the CIA, but, their dissemination to us under whatever circumstances they could disseminate was clearly not as expansive as the flow of information coming from the agency. But we had good personal relationships at the top. I think they'll confirm that. And we had agency relationships, although not as extensive as the ones with the CIA.
And how do we try to improve as quickly as we can the relationship between the FBI and the CIA, not with information sharing, not with sitting down in a meeting, simply talking to one another, but the collaboration, the follow-up, the implementation? How would you suggest that, given that you say you had a good relationship with the current director? What would be your 2 or 3 pieces of advice to Mr. Tenet and Mr. Mueller to get that relationship off to a very good start, and how do we improve that in the future?
Well, I think the interoperability of our data is probably critical. As I alluded to before, having that infrastructure dynamic would actually start driving some of the personal relationships because the data would be transparent and readily exchangeable and viewable. That's the first thing. The interoperability of our agents and officers overseas. For the first time in the history of the agencies, Mr. Tenet and I had our legats meet with our station chiefs all over the world, overseas as well as back here in the United States. That was complemented by the officer exchange at headquarters that I mentioned. The cases that were worked in New York, again, we have dedicated FBI CIA teams working overseas, exploiting information, conducting counterterrorism operations for intelligence purposes and simultaneously for obtaining evidence, maintaining chains of custody, and using it in evidence. That's the kind of collaboration that goes well beyond the 2 directors sitting down and having an excellent relationship, which they did and do have at this time. So those would be my top 3.
I want to thank the panel again for their work in the past on terrorism, and Mr. Chairman, thank you for